scoppia la guerra tra l'Ucraina e la Russia, per noi è stato un momento estremamente triste, doloroso e anche molto oneroso, perché il mercato russo per noi ha sempre rappresentato intorno al 20-25%, quindi ha una buona fetta del nostro fatturato.
It's amazing how much attention has been placed on Germany's dependency on Russia. But actually, Italy follows a close second within the EU.
This is a war economy, so we are suffering and has affected substantially Italian business with the sanctions and with the energy prices.
It raises all kinds of questions about whether Giorgia Meloni really will be able to maintain Italy's support for Ukraine and a tough stand against the Russian invasion.
Allora, mi chiamo Paolo Amato, sono presidente della Locati. La nostra sì è un'impresa di famiglia, io rappresento la 6ª generazione e i miei figli la 7ª. Noi da 7 generazioni serviamo le case reali più belle al mondo. Direttamente abbiamo avuto il piacere e l'onore di servire la regina Elisabetta, la regina madre. In questo posto abbiamo raccolto tessuti di grande valore come broccati, sete, ma anche pellami. Ovviamente abbiamo numerosi materiali con prezzi che possono variare da poche decine di euro a molte centinaia di euro. E quindi la logica conseguenza vuole dei prodotti che in base alle tempistiche, quindi le ore di lavoro che vengono utilizzate per crearli e i materiali utilizzati, possono oscillare da qualche centinaio di euro a qualche migliaio. Il fondo, i fianchi della borsa che verrà realizzata nel febbraio del 2022 siamo stati costretti a non poter esportare il nostro prodotto. Essendo noi un'azienda che produce articoli di lusso, gran parte di questi erano destinati al mercato proprio russo. Quindi ci siamo ritrovati ad avere i magazzini con oggetti di altissimo valore, con anche delle caratteristiche in forma e colore e design destinate ad un mercato che non era il mercato europeo, quindi di difficile collocazione.
Now, Italy has been caught on the wrong side of this long-term investment bet and is having to disentangle itself and is finding it quite hard to do.
Per noi ha rappresentato un grosso danno e direttive europee imponevano delle sanzioni e quindi queste sanzioni erano il non poter esportare in un mercato come quello russo, che invece per noi era un mercato estremamente importante.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, Italy benefited enormously from Russia's economic recovery and the rise of a wealthy upper middle class in particular who seemed to consume Italian goods in vast quantities.
Quindi noi dal 1996-97 abbiamo cominciato a ricevere i primi russi, ma le prime vendite, inteso come proprio vendita a negozi o a qualche department store, è iniziato negli anni 2005-2006.
The fact that we had a loss of business because of the sanctions has affected the public opinion. The other effect is the inflation, and then there is a big discussion about inflation, but it's clear that this inflation in Europe is not demand-led, it's supply-led, and the reason why we have an increase in prices is very much related to the increase in energy prices, which is a consequence of the war in Ukraine, because obviously we had to reassess completely our energy sources and move them from Russia to anywhere else, including the US, because now the US is one of the major provider of energy for Europe and for Italy.
Italy was the 4th Russian export destination up until 2021, and clearly Italy's energy dependence with Russia has been a big theme throughout the past 20 years. 40% of Italy's gas and most of its coal came from Russia up until the war broke out, and a certain percentage of the oil and the crude that Italy uses as well.
Italy also kind of diversified the energy supply by going to Northern Africa, making deals with interesting countries like Algeria or Libya, which I wouldn't say are particularly democratic at the moment. But this has had a huge impact on Italian finances and has had a huge impact on the on Italian families.
Il contesto nel quale si troverà ad agire il governo è un contesto molto complicato, forse il più difficile dal secondo dopoguerra ad oggi. Le tensioni geopolitiche e la crisi energetica frenano la speranza di una ripresa economica post-pandemia. Le previsioni macroeconomiche per il 2023 indicano un marcato rallentamento dell'economia italiana, europea e mondiale, in un clima per di più di assoluta incertezza.
Si parla di rapporti commerciali con la Russia che sono stati interrotti a causa della guerra. Questo ci ha messo in gravi difficoltà anche perché tutti i servizi bancari sono stati bloccati. Ci siamo ritrovati con dei pagamenti a cui non abbiamo potuto attingere perché bloccati appunto dalle restrizioni determinate dai paesi europei. Quindi questo è stato la prima botta, la prima conseguenza, non poter accedere a questo credito che noi vantavamo.
The sanctions regime from the West was incredibly quick, stealthy, and powerful. If you were a business operating in Russia with Russian customers, you probably used one of the Western banks. Quickly, those relationships were closed, and a lot of these business people had to look for elsewhere to have their banking services.
Even if the war is ongoing and Russia has been sanctioned by the EU, there are companies that continue doing business with Russia. There are Italian banks that have not shut down their operations in Russia.
UniCredit's been in Russia since 2005. At the outbreak of the war, it had about 2 million customers, 70 branches, and about 3,500 staff. So a pretty big presence in Russia. Among the international banks, it was among the top 3 with the biggest exposure in Russia. Andrea Orcel, the CEO of UniCredit, has consistently said he doesn't want to leave money on the table. He doesn't want to essentially hand over their Russian business to Putin's allies and to the Kremlin. The prospect of selling the business has become much, much harder in the last 6 months because the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin have actually intervened to basically rubber stamp any sale of a Western bank in Russia, and that makes it much harder because you're essentially having to sell to people who are very closely tied to the Kremlin. That's not something that UniCredit want to do, and also really the Kremlin would be dictating the terms of those sales and would be demanding much lower prices than what the businesses are actually worth. At a European banking level, the ECB has openly called on UniCredit and other banks with big Russian presence to really exit as swiftly as they can. There have been private conversations as well. So it's in a very tricky position playing this big geopolitical tensions, and it's very much been caught in the middle of all those.
The coalition is composed by 3 parties. You have Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, which is led by Meloni, Giorgia Meloni, and she's also the Prime Minister and the first female Prime Minister in Italian history. She got 26% of the vote, so she is leading the coalition by all means. The junior partners in this government coalition are on one side Silvio Berlusconi, who is in his 80s and is the leader of Forza Italia. And on the other side of the coalition, you have Matteo Salvini, who is actually the leader of the League, La Lega. They have not enough votes even put together to represent a credible alternative to Meloni.
L'unica volta al mondo in cui le sanzioni che dovrebbero fermare la Russia, punire la Russia, mettere in ginocchio la Russia e fermare la guerra della Russia, invece di punire i russi, stanno punendo gli italiani.
Salvini is coming forward to once again make the case that the Western strategy of sanctions against Russia and isolating Russia isn't working. Matteo Salvini has made no secret of his admiration for Putin. He's been filmed wearing Putin t-shirts in Red Square, and he wore Putin t-shirts in the EU Parliament, and so he is really what some would describe as a Putin fanboy.
Cari amici, i primi due incontri importanti della Lega Nord a Mosca, il primo col Presidente della Commissione Esteri Puškov, totale sintonia per dire no alle sanzioni economiche contro la Russia.
More than being pro-Russians or pro-Putin, the grassroots of Salvini's movement, or the Lega, are actually pro their own business. And the sanctions is hurting the Italian industrial sector seriously, because both Berlusconi and particularly Salvini are political animals, they know it. So they sense it. They say that there is a possibility of getting part of the electorate on ending the war in Ukraine, ending the sanctions towards Putin and so on.
You can see it's also a symbiotic relationship where a lot of these right-wing parties, they know that Russia is out there and might be willing to help them.
Putin has become an icon of this world. These days, many voters of the League or Brothers of Italy, they actually like Putin. They like him personally.
Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, are, whatever they say, a post-fascist movement. The fact that they say that they are not neo-fascist or post-fascist, or they've never been fascists, they have to say it because there is still a clause in the Italian constitution which is anti-fascism, but they actually were fascists, particularly Miss Meloni, because she was a member of MSI, which is Movimento Sociale Italiano, a fascist party.
What has been particularly interesting in the last decade or so is how Russia has really latched onto the idea of right-wing populist politics in Europe as a very powerful lever of influence. Russia really wants to destabilize the center ground of politics in Europe and to remove from power all of those stable political centrist governments that are better positioned to stand up to Russia.
Putin's United Russia Party forged political links with all kinds of actors in different parts of the Italian political spectrum. So on one hand, we have Salvini, the leader of the League, who was an unabashed Putin admirer. But we also, elsewhere on the political spectrum, have the Five Star Party, which also is believed or suspected to have person-to-person ties with key people in Russia.
Giorgia Meloni's government is going to be probably permanently embarrassed by some of the instincts of her coalition partners.
Putin è stato spinto dalla popolazione russa, dal suo partito, dai suoi ministri a inventarsi questa operazione speciale, così era stata chiamata agli inizi, per cui le truppe russe dovevano entrare in una settimana a raggiungere Kiev, sostituire con un governo di persone per bene il governo di Zelensky e un'altra settimana ritornare indietro.
These two men have always liked each other. There's been a close bond between the two. But he has always had a fascination for the Soviets, for Russia, and for Vladimir Putin. They've gone on holiday together reportedly, and they've always been quite friendly. And this has also translated into closer business ties and economic ties between the two countries. Berlusconi and Putin first met at the G7 in Genoa. There was an immediate bond between the two, and after that meeting in 2001, there were many phone calls. You have to imagine in 2003, the war in Chechnya, when reporters asked Berlusconi to comment the atrocities committed by the Russians that were well documented and well known, Berlusconi said, please, let's not spread legends.
Da amico della Federazione Russa, da amico ed estimatore personale del presidente Putin, dico non continuiamo a diffondere queste leggende, guardiamo alla realtà dei fatti, perché è sulla realtà dei fatti che si debbono costruire delle corrette opinioni. Ti chiedo scusa, ti manderò la parcella.
Silvio Berlusconi, he imagined himself and Italy as this bridge that was going to usher a once isolated Vladimir Putin and Russia into the family of the West. He had all kinds of schemes.
when he was talking to Putin? Was it on behalf of the Republic of Italy, or was it himself? Where did one Berlusconi begin, or when did the other one end? It was never really clear.
Russian oligarchs saw Italy as a relatively welcoming place where they could invest. Many major oligarchs bought large industrial assets in Italy. They bought mansions and beachside holiday homes. And of course, all of this was facilitated by the great relationship between Italy's Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
We are important as a country for Russia because we are perceived, and at least in part we are, a weak link within the European Union. Even in the process, for example, of the sanctioning the Russian oligarchs or the voting motions in the EU Parliament.
After World War II, Italy had the largest communist party in Western Europe. Many of the partisans that fought against Mussolini and fascism and on the side of the Allies were actually communists. They were members of the Communist Party of Italy.
A huge party. Many millions of Italians pledging allegiance to Moscow and to the communist cause. And that's, of course, hugely important in the strategic equation.
Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Brothers of Italy, the far-right party, a post-fascist party, has had pro-Russian sympathies in the past. But at this moment, she has taken a pretty firm stance and I think has, in a way, cleverly created a narrative about how a party like hers should be supporting Ukraine. This is a country struggling for national survival, and as a nationalist party, or leader of a nationalist party, she can see the value in that.
Quella in Ucraina è una guerra di aggressione che noi non possiamo accettare.
She has been a very strong supporter of the US, of the Republican Party, and now she knows that in order to stay in power, she cannot push anti-EU or anti-NATO rhetorics.
We are on the side of international law. We are on the side of freedom. And indeed, we are on the side of a proud nation that is teaching the world what it means to fight for freedom.
Italy's partners and certainly Kiev should probably rest reasonably assured that Italy will not deviate massively from this path. The issue in Italy is public opinion. It's clearly the softest in this war, although there is a majority in favor of support for Ukraine. It's the narrowest majority that there is in the EU, and Italians are also more likely than other European countries to pin blame on Kiev or even on NATO and the West for this conflict.
This is all relevant if you have elections, however, if it becomes less relevant if you do not have elections. And again, even if we did have elections, until when the international coalition is so much favorable to intervention in Ukraine, even for an Italian government who is against it, it would be almost impossible to pull off.
Considerando che il 97% del tessuto industriale è rappresentato da piccole imprese, il rischio non è quello di avere soltanto una perdita di tipo economico, ma ci sono delle imprese il cui rischio è quello della chiusura e chiudere vuol dire, nel nostro settore, come in tanti altri, perdere il know-how. Quindi il grande rischio che stiamo correndo è che il piccolo artigiano che era abile a fare queste cose e il russo gli piaceva venire in Italia, fare l'acquisto nel piccolo artigiano, se la faceva fare come voleva lui. Adesso non può più venire e l'artigiano come fa a sopravvivere? A chi la vende?